Monster Professor.
Welcome to the Monster Professor, a show in which we discuss and explore monsters in literature, myth, film, games, folklore, culture, and beyond. We're going to dig deep, so be prepared. I'm your host, Josh Woods, author, editor, professor, and monster expert, and today we're going to talk about zombies. Now, I know you know what zombies are because The Walking Dead for many years was the most watched television show but in the standard adult age range. So I think that they classify that as like 18 to like 50 or something like that in America. The most watched television show in history was The Walking Dead. And so not only did the era of like horror being fringe fully and officially end at that point, but even like zombie, which is like fringe of a fringe, zombie horror, that those days went away, and now zombies are full on mainstream in our culture. They have been in many ways, not only in modern American pop culture, but I would say in literature and a whole bunch of other cultures throughout time. That's kind of the overriding thesis of this whole podcast thing. But now at least we have further evidence that when we talk about monsters, we're talking about things central in our culture. And so zombies, as we understand them, in essentially they're kind of a pop culture creation mixed of two different traditions. And so when I say zombies as we understand them, I'm thinking of the shambling hordes of the recently deceased come back animated but mindless or soulless, and then they just gather together and chase down anything that seems like live flesh to eat it or eat its brains. And you can only kill them by re-kill them, destroy them by removing the head or destroying the brain, right? So and they're infectious. Let's not forget that when zombies are around, being bitten by a zombie or dying in zombie land makes you a zombie. So that whole thing is essentially is a pop culture tradition more than necessarily a literature tradition. And I mean pop culture as in like it shows up in film, but it really pulls together its rules, its words, its terms, its a system. It really pulls together by people talking about the films, and it's kind of in books, but books are influenced by the films, and films are influenced by the books, and it's all influenced by what people think about it and say about it outside of those works. And so it's a cool construction, but it kind of comes from two different traditions. One of them is the stories, those that are intentionally stories. The other one, I want to get into the other one first. It's a little less known, and I'm talking about the voodoo tradition, specific to Haiti, actually. Now, voodoo does show up in other parts of the Caribbean and even a little bit in parts of the American South, but in the American South, what we see is not so much voodoo as hoodoo. And they're kind of related, but they are distinct in that hoodoo is a purely folk tradition of like ground level, everyday magic to make your life better and to make the lives of your enemies worse. And so that's the tradition that if you have in mind, for instance, like going to this consult with this creepy kind of almost witch doctor like figure, and they like sell you cat bones and a bag of a certain type of herbs to burn over an Osage orange fire at a certain type of night while you write the name of the person you love and toss it in the fire, gather up those ashes, mix it in the water of the person that you love, and if he or she drinks it, they will instantly fall in love with you. Right? That's hoodoo, not voodoo. So that's what I mean by that, like ground level magic with real tangible ingredients for direct and essentially kind of quotidian results. By the way, that's not the actual love spell. So if you were taking notes on that, you might as well scratch those out. I'm not going to tell you the actual love spell on the podcast. That might get me in trouble, because actually the FBI was going after hoodoo practitioners for a while. Actually, I'm kind of getting off track of zombies. Okay, let me get back on track on zombies. I think we might have to do a whole episode on how cool hoodoo gets. There were even drugstores, actual legitimate drugstores like down in New Orleans, that were specifically hoodoo pharmacies. But voodoo is different. Voodoo is a mix of like standardized West African traditional ceremonies and traditional religions with kind of a New World version of Catholicism that ended up being the main kind of religion down in the Caribbean. And so a mix of those two, especially among the Haitian slaves, the West African slaves, that created voodoo. And that by a lot of sociologists or say cultural experts, they'll consider voodoo to be a legitimate religion or a legitimate sub-religion, as opposed to kind of the folk magic that hoodoo is. And so in that way, and I don't mean to say hoodoo is illegitimate, but voodoo is recognized as a type of religion. But in the voodoo tradition, there's still some interaction with the world of the spirit, or there are ways that, voodoo religious leaders can identify things going wrong with a spirit or soul. Or in voodoo tradition, actually, your whole soul is made out of the flesh and the spirit too. And so if one or the two are not connected to the other one, then you end up with a zombie. And originally, the word zombie referred to a spirit that has been like wrongly disconnected from its body. And so like some type of ghost or phantom kind of thing. And the word really gets going in the English language in the late 1800s as being thrown around as like another word for like a creepy or spooky ghost. But then it starts getting picked up a little bit later in these writings about the kinds of traditions of Haiti, and that some of the slaves down in Haiti, their spirits were taken out of their bodies, and so all you have left is the flesh. And so the spirit, who knows where that thing went to, but we just have this body wandering around following simple orders and doing as it's told, and so it continues being a slave. And there's some evidence that some of the Haitian slave masters, most of whom were West African themselves, would take those kinds of traditions out of voodoo and threaten the active slaves with it. Those who were still slaves, it would say like, look, if you kill yourself, then you will come back as a zombie and you'll be a slave forever. The only way to get out of it is to keep being a slave, right? Or they would threaten him if they try to run away, that they would put him through the process of becoming a zombie. And so there's very much a connection between zombie and slave, or doing anything that you're told. But if that tradition had kept on, it would have been a lot closer to the tradition of, say, the golem, or the tradition of the robot, which started in Prague, 1800s. And we'll definitely have to do a future episode on golems and robots. But the original zombie tradition was connected with that. The way that we understand it in pop culture really didn't start happening until Richard Matheson's book, I Am Legend, in 1954. That's when you get hordes and hordes of the shambling dead who are kind of mindless, attacking a living person as he boards up his house, reinforces it from nightly attacks of these things. In Matheson's book, I mentioned that in an earlier episode, Monsters in Literature. I forget, was it part 3? Monsters in Literature part 3, I think, on this podcast. So I talk a little bit about that. In his book, these were essentially vampires. What would kill them was a stake through the heart. They were afraid of crosses and mirrors and this kind of thing. But in his book, he tried to turn all of these monster rules into science, saying that what's left of this, it was like some sort of virus that spread or something like that. It's a little bit vague, but what's left of these people, there's something deep in their psychology, that if they see their own reflection of their dead selves in a mirror, they're horrified, so that's why they don't like mirrors. If they see reminders of the transcendent, like a cross, then they're horrified deep in their memory somehow, unconsciously, and so that's why they don't like, the sign of the cross or something. It was kind of weak on the science. I don't think there was really much need for that, but that tradition, that change did end up influencing the tradition quite a bit. And so they weren't called zombies in I Am Legend. The real turn for the zombies happened in 1968 with George Romero's Night of the Living Dead. And that's an amazing film, and that still holds up, I think. I think you don't have to really watch it and go, oh, well, but it was in the late 60s. What did they know about filmmaking then? So isn't it kind of cute? I think it still holds up, every bit of it to this day. It's a really good one. And I think some people are kind of surprised when they're familiar with more modern versions of zombies to go back and watch that. The first zombie in that film, as I recall, they're in a cemetery. The two main characters are in a cemetery. Barbara and her brother with the driving gloves. I don't know. They're in their car at the cemetery, and then here comes some recently escaped dead person, and he's a zombie. And so they flee and get in a car, and the zombie can't get to him. And so he looks around and he finds a rock and he picks it up and he uses that to break the window to get to him. And so they're like tool using undead creatures. And then very quickly that level of intelligence fades away. And then they just move all the way down to kind of like these forces of nature who can't do a whole lot more than tree branches in the wind. They just like push their arms around until they stumble into something alive, that kind of thing. But at least at the very beginning of this tradition, they used to be able to use tools. I think The Walking Dead would have been a much more intense show if the hordes and hordes of the dead were like picking up boards and putting nails in them, or trying to find guns of their own and shoot at Rick and his crew. That would have been a lot tougher. I don't think they would have made it. So even though that was the film that really started the tradition. Oh, I failed to mention, by the way, that George Romero was essentially doing his version of Richard Matheson's I Am Legend, the book. That was his primary influence. Nothing like that had really happened in literature or film or anything like that before Richard Matheson. George Romero read it, loved it, and did his version of it on film. In that film, you actually get what we could call now a whole bunch of social commentary, or at least it invites that kind of thing. Like you didn't find many, unless it was like specifically cultural movie or something like that. You didn't find many lead roles being played by black actors, but you did in Night of the Living Dead, and it wasn't an issue in the film that drew attention to itself, and so it wasn't even like an overt statement. Instead, it was just a part of this film where they were all focusing on how horrifying these like returned dead were, and everybody was being under attack or falling under attack, and you got this little crew just trying to survive in this house. And they're like of different social classes as well, and they're having a hard time getting along and hard time like agreeing as to who's in charge. Should anyone even be in charge? What's the best survival strategy? Like hole up in the basement, or defend the upper floors, or just try to escape. And by the time it's all said and done, you see that when the living people finally catch on, then they start hunting down these zombies, and then you get this montage at the end of how horrifying. They're just stringing up people, and it's very reminiscent of like lynchings and stuff, and you feel really bad for these horrifying zombies by the end of it. And so it invites a whole lot of interpretations that would tend towards social commentary. That tradition stuck with zombies for sure, I think, and I think it's one of the reasons why zombies tend to be, I would say, one of the two essentially 20th century monsters. I'll get to my theory on that in just a moment. But back to just the simple tradition of the zombie, nowhere in that film does anyone say zombie, right? And so that ends up even being a sub-tradition of the zombie pop cultures. In a zombie story or zombie film, comic book, whatever, you're not really supposed to say zombie. It's just everybody's supposed to know that's what they are. And so they go to like these weird lengths to avoid saying the word zombie. In The Walking Dead, you got to call them walkers, or, and was it in Shaun of the Dead, which is actually it holds up really well as just a pure zombie film, on top of holding up well as a brilliantly written comedy. One of the characters chastises the other one for actually saying zombie. He's like, "Oh, we got to get away from the zombies." It's like, don't call them that. Don't say the Z word. So no one says zombie in Night of the Living Dead, but everyone after that movie came out not everyone, a lot of people started talking about that film and the monsters in this film as zombies, and they got that from from the Haitian tradition. There was a really early film starring Bela Lugosi called White Zombie. And that's a pretty cool film. It's not as cool, as well put together as like Dracula or anything like that. It does have a cool soundtrack. And in that film, you get the zombie tradition that's much more Haitian and voodoo, and that this essentially this magician overlord brainwashes other people into doing his bidding, and so the brainwashed person is the zombie, and so that's the whole focus of White Zombie. And so that original voodoo tradition of the brainwashed slave just shambling around doing what he or she is told finally mixes with this Richard Matheson kind of tradition of like hordes of the undead that you're fighting and defending yourself from, mixed together right after Romero's Night of the Living Dead, so that people talking about the film finally said, well, let's call them zombies, because that's what it seems like. And then officially the two intertwine, and now we have zombies. So we get some really cool films after that. 78, Dawn of the Dead, is a really cool one, in that it expands the vision of what happens when you have a world of the undead. Like what would you do to survive long term, not just like through the night, but week after week? And what would other settings be like under zombie apocalypse attack, right? And so you get to spend a lot of time in a mall for days and even weeks on end to see what kind of toll that long-term survivalist attitude takes on people. And that ends up becoming a pretty strong tradition in zombie culture as well. So I said, I think zombies are one of the two essential monsters of the 20th century. And I kind of I'll stretch out the 20th century as in from World War I to kind of now, right? So it's not strictly the 20th century. Let's say the long 20th. I would say it really gets going in World War I and what we consider our modern kind of world all the way up to roughly about now. I think we have two. The scholar Tom Shippey makes a really good argument that Tolkien's ring wraiths in Lord of the Rings are a type of monster that only really hits home and only fully makes sense in view of two world wars, ideological possession, totalitarianism that you see on the far right and the far left, industrialization of war, and politicians essentially buying into a soulless deal with the devil over and over again. In fact, that becomes the new definition of politician, right? Is somebody who's a vacant, soulless kind of tool of whatever interests or influences come at such a politician or whatever it takes just to gain power. The ring wraiths are that essential monster. Maybe one day, I don't know if you're listening to this, Tom Shippey, maybe I would, I've talked to him before over email, maybe I can get him on the show. That would be a huge delight. But I would say the other one is the zombie, because essentially what is a zombie as a monster, but this tangible and strong image of the loss of individuality like this. And that's a real problem that I think we have to now face in the modern world since the world wars on and through a highly technological mass media world in which the temptation to go fully collectivist is all over the place. Why put in the hard work of trying to be an individual, find out who you are, and have your own thoughts and your own opinions and your own will and your own goals when everyone wants you to just be positioned in this collective? And so, and it's harder to be an individual than just to be a worker. I mean, more and more there's a push for forget about critical thinking or forget about the arts and focus on vocation, learn how to obey rules and learn how to be a subject. And in a world where you have not only this push toward collectivism, but then you have a lot of people feeling a loss of personality, a loss of personal connection to others, a lot of psychoactive drugs that make people report to feel like less of themselves and more like in a cloud. You add on top of that concerns about population that people are really uncomfortable talking about, so much so that that's one of the taboo topics, I would say, at least in the 21st century, is you're not supposed to talk about the idea of overpopulation as a problem. In fact, now some people, otherwise smart people, are saying, no, who says overpopulation is a problem? We could hold, trillions of people on planet Earth. There's no problem with that, so quit talking about it. Well, yeah, we can stop talking about it and try to like make the subject taboo, but the fear's still there. You know, when you're going through a city, that it sure feels like there's more people all around you than seems natural. And not all of them seem like individuals to you anymore. Or there's the fear of that, right? And then there's the fear of, oh no, what if I'm one of this, just one more member of this collectivist kind of soulless, mindless group, just essentially responding to all the different influences of mind control all around me, from media to pop culture to whatever. It's a real struggle, I would say, in the modern era. And what better representation of that than the zombie? This thing that you can keep fighting and you can keep trying to keep at bay by boarding up the windows and keeping your own small little group alive. But sooner or later, they're going to bite you or you're going to die and you're going to turn into one of these two. So it's just a matter of time. It's pretty terrifying. And I would say insightful for the real struggles that we're going through now. So back to some cool zombie stories. There was a film by a guy named, I'm going to mispronounce it. I pronounce it Lucio Fulci, but it might be like Lucio Fulci or something like that. He made a film that when I saw it, it was called Zombie, but the original like European title, I'm told, is like called Zombie 2, that it was meant to be the sequel to Dawn of the Dead, even though Dawn of the Dead was kind of a sequel to Night of the Living Dead. But anyway, it had a lot of production problems. But this thing was strange. I don't know how often it's noticed or rewatched these days, but if you've missed it, it's worth checking out. It tries to get back a little bit to that Haitian voodoo tradition, and that the film in large part takes place in Haiti, and it mixes this like scientist exploring this zombie phenomenon and then accidentally spreading it beyond the island. And there are some weird scenes. First of all, the zombies in that film look really old and dead and rotten, and they have just a completely different look than we're used to. Normally, we see these zombies who are fully healthy people with like, scabs. And maybe their skin is slightly discolored, and then they have a couple of wounds here and there, or maybe they have like big teeth sticking out. But otherwise, they look like they could be real people. But in this film, they look full on like real dead corpses, and it's pretty creepy. At one point, the zombie kind of fog spreads so deeply that really, really long dead people rise up. And this is set in the 70s, but even a conquistador, the corpse of an old conquistador, rises up and attacks people. And I think the coolest scene of all has to be the time when the zombie falls into the water with a shark. And so they have a scene in which a shark fights a zombie, and they've got a real live actor playing the zombie down there fighting the shark. He's in full zombie makeup. You don't see any oxygen tanks or anything for him down there. And it's a real shark, and it's actually like ripping his limbs off. And they do plenty of special effects in there, but it's an actual guy underwater in full zombie makeup fighting a shark. If that's not worth watching, I don't know what is. We've got some cool zombie books. I think the number one has to be Max Brooks's World War Z. I'm told they made a film of this, of World War Z, and I was also advised strongly not to watch it, so I haven't actually seen it. But the book is excellent. It's a series of essentially short stories or glimpses or vignettes of different people surviving through a worldwide zombie apocalypse or plague. And the brilliance of this book is that It plays out just about every zombie scenario you could imagine. Like, all right, zombie apocalypse hits planet Earth. What would be the really interesting outliers? What about somebody who was flying a jet at the time, right? When they can't safely land anymore, what's going to happen to them? And then you get that story. Or you go, okay, no, what about this? What about people on a nuclear submarine that doesn't have to like refuel really? All they need is periodically to get supplies, bring it back on the submarine, and then go back underwater. Wouldn't they be perfectly safe? Well, you get a section about people on this nuclear submarine. Like, okay, what about people on the space station off of planet Earth? What would happen to them when the zombie apocalypse happens? Well, you get that section as well, and they're all really well researched. Max Brooks pulled all the strings that he had available to him. He's the son of Mel Brooks, the filmmaker, by the way. So he had a lot of resources available to him, and he put them to good use, man, because this book is awesome. I would be remiss if I were to not mention one of the most influential modern zombie films. And I don't know how many people realize how influential this was, but it was a film written by the brilliant Alex Garland. Alex Garland, by the way, has got to be one of the best screenwriters, period, I would say. And at least my top 3 favorite screenwriters of all time. A guy named Alex Garland wrote the script for Ex Machina, wrote the script for Dread, wrote the script for a film called 28 Days Later, although filmed by someone else. This came out in 2002. And this essentially wrote the DNA for other zombie things to come. When you get a movie like Shaun of the Dead 2 years later, although Simon Pegg and Edgar Wright had been working on, a kind of a zombie parody, because they're huge zombie film fans, they've been working on it for years. But a huge influence on them, of course, was 28 Days Later. But that essentially wrote the DNA for like Walking Dead as well, in that it starts off with somebody waking up in a hospital, 28 days later, somebody waking up in a hospital, and the zombie apocalypse has been raging on around him. He was in a coma, though, for the whole start of it, and so he wakes up completely clueless, has to find his way through this abandoned city, and then spend some time with this new crew kind of trying to fight and survive their way around the city and finally out of the city. That's Walking Dead season 1. And then in the film, they go out into this like farm area and they try to things seem a whole lot nicer and safer in that section of the film, or act 2 of the film, until they realize things go bad and it's not as safe as they thought. That's Walking Dead season 2. And then the third act of the film, they spend in this pseudo-military fortress, and then the real struggle there is no longer the zombies, but instead kind of tyrannical fascist psychopaths that they have to fight with and contend with. And then you start to realize, oh, the zombies might have been bad, but the real monsters and the real horror are living people, ourselves. And that's season 3 of Walking Dead on through however many there are now. I think the rest of them just stretched that concept out. And so that all came from Alex Garland, 28 Days Later. A brilliant script and from a brilliant screenwriter that really took a lot of the potential of what the zombie story means and what it means for individuals and what it means for our culture, and then pieced it together in the right settings, in the right kind of way. And everybody else has been kind of trying to do their version of his zombie story ever since. I haven't really taken any time to tell you any kind of personal tangents or anything for an episode or two. So how about ever so brief? I've got a bunch of zombie ones. I used to Well, most of my personal stories are, I used to be terrified of this. Well, I used to be really terrified of zombies as well. And they haunt the idea that suddenly I'd wake up and I'd be the last little normal kid in the world and everybody'd be a zombie to get me. It just terrified me. So any hint at anything zombie would terrify me. Even Michael Jackson's Thriller or like parodies coming on TV of anything zombie would be even people just saying the word zombie would kind of unnerve me as a kid. But one brief personal story. One Halloween, as an adult, my wife and I were in St. Louis. We were dressed up as, I don't remember what we were dressed up as clearly, or if there was even anything clear that we had in mind. We were just kind of dressed up creepy with makeup, so we were kind of zombie-like, and we were just hanging out around St. Louis, walking around in some neighborhood that seemed to be kind of lively for Halloween. And then we saw this big, like, horde of people dressed up like zombies kind of shambling down the road. And we thought, hey, let's go along with them. And so we went and joined the crowd. And we're just all wandering around and talking and chatting and hanging out. And then, and going down the road, and then everybody stops, and then music starts playing somewhere, and it's Michael Jackson's Thriller, and everybody around, I look around, and suddenly everybody is in formation, except for my wife and I, we're looking, and then they all start dancing, and, in synchronized fashion, this full Thriller choreography from the music video, and I'm in the middle of it going, I have no idea what's going on. And so I run out of there just not to mess up their choreography. And so I guess they were doing this kind of flash mob thing, and I was in the middle of it and had no idea. And so I got zombie mobbed, but instead of through violence and cannibalism, I got attacked by a zombie mob with choreography. I don't know. It was a fun, cool moment. Well, I hope you enjoyed this episode of The Monster Professor, and I hope you're enjoying your October. Stay tuned next week to find out what kind of spooky, scary things we're going to talk about, because that will be the episode of Halloween. Talk to you next time on The Monster Professor.